Have you ever tried to photograph the moon and found you were having trouble? I'm going to show you how. It's not as difficult as you think, so stay tuned. Many people think that photographing the moon is a real challenge, but it's really not that difficult, and I'm going to show you how. All you need is a camera that you can use manual settings on, a telephoto lens, and a tripod. And even the tripod is optional if you've got another way of stabilising your camera. There are really only three things you need to consider when you're shooting the moon. First is how to expose correctly. Second is how to focus on such a small moving target in the sky. And third is how you can stabilise your camera, because if you're using a long telephoto lens, you're going to need to keep it still. Many people find this a challenge when shooting the moon, but it shouldn't be. It's usually because they have their cameras set to evaluative or matrix metering, and that they're using automatic or semi-automatic settings without adjusting the exposure values in their camera. If you're shooting at night, then most of the frame is going to be black. And remember that your camera is trying to expose the photograph to have a mid-tone grey as the average exposure, so that when it's looking at a lot of black, it's going to significantly overexpose and you end up with just a white disc for the moon. Now you can use the old trick that we used to use back in the days with the dinosaurs when we didn't have exposure meters in cameras, and that was called the sunny f16 rule. And that simply states that the shutter speed should be the reciprocal of your ISO when the aperture is set to f16. For example, if you set your camera to ISO 400, aperture f16, then your shutter speed should be 1/400th of a second to expose something under normal, bright, sunny daylight. Now, you're not always going to be shooting at f16, and in fact I wouldn't advise it when you're shooting the moon. I usually shoot at about f8. This lens on this camera has, at 400 millimeters, has a maximum aperture of f6.3, and I usually stop that down about 2/3 of a stop to f8. But at f8, that's 2 stops faster than f16, so all you need to do is increase your shutter speed 2 stops to say 1/1600th of a second at ISO 400. It's that easy. Now I normally overexpose about 1.5 to 2 stops again, just to make sure that I have enough detail in the brights so that I can adjust those properly when I get them into Lightroom and Photoshop later. Depending on the autofocus settings you have available in your camera, autofocus may not work very well when trying to photograph the moon. I prefer to use manual. Before you even try and frame up the moon, set your focus on the lens to infinity. Then frame up the moon, and then micro tweak the focus, just a few little changes backwards and forwards until you've got the focus set right. If you've got focus peaking available, then turn that on. Focus peaking is where you get the in-camera feedback, where you get these little coloured dots appearing on the areas in the image that are in focus while you're using manual focus. And that's a really good way of telling when the moon is in focus, because there's high contrast obviously between the outline of the moon and the black background, and you should get this little coloured ring around the moon when the moon is in focus. If you want to use autofocus, try an autofocus setting that gives you the smallest possible area of focus on the frame, and then line that up with the edge of the moon and your autofocus should work pretty well. But once you've got it in focus using autofocus, then switch to manual focus so that you've got that focus point fixed. And that's because the moon is going to move slowly across your frame, and if you're using a tripod and you've got your camera stable, then the moon is going to move out of your autofocus setting, and when you go and take a shot, the camera's going to track focus backwards and forwards, and you may never get it back again, and you'll have to go back and start again. Keeping your camera stable is going to be the best way you can possibly make a sharp image. Getting focus is easy enough, but if your camera is wobbling around and moving all over the place, you're going to get a blurred image unless you're shooting at a very fast shutter speed. I suggest you use a tripod. If you don't want to use a tripod and you want a hand hold, make sure you've got very good hand holding technique, because on a long lens, even the micro adjustment with your hands is going to make a blurry image. Turn on stabilization in your lens or stabilization in your camera, or both if you've got that as a possibility. If you don't have stabilization in your camera or in your lens, then I suggest you use a very fast shutter speed. At least 1,000th of a second, if not faster. That might mean you need to bump the ISO up, but you're better off having a little bit of noise in the image and still having it sharp than a perfectly clean image that's blurry. But I suggest you use a tripod. It will give you two things. Firstly, it'll enable you to stabilize the camera to give you the best possible chance of getting sharp images. The second thing it does is it slows you down. It gives you the chance to frame your shot, get the focus right, get the exposure right, take a shot, evaluate it on the back of the camera, tweak the focus a little bit, tweak the exposure a little bit, take another shot. If you're hand holding, you tend to just point and shoot. You tend to point, focus, trying to hold the camera as still as possible, and then shoot, and then shoot, and then shoot. And you don't really slow down and take time to evaluate, review, and change settings if you need to. I use a gimbal head on my tripod so that I can move the camera around, and it makes framing much easier. It also makes it much easier just to do that little minor tracking when I want to keep the moon in the center of the screen. If you are, as I suggest, going to use a tripod, then I suggest getting one of these. This is a remote release. This enables you to keep your hands off the camera, because even the lightest touch on the shutter button when you're using a long telephoto lens on a small object is going to create a little bit of vibration. So if you can use something like this to avoid that, you'll get better shots. Now, if you don't have one of these, you can switch your camera to the 2-second timer. And that means that when you press the shutter, take your hand away, the camera takes 2 seconds before it releases the shutter, which means that you've got the stability back in the camera without any vibration caused by you handling it. And lastly, take lots of shots. It's going to take a while to tweak your focus and your exposure to get that right, and the stability of your camera is going to be quite variable. Even the most minor shake in the camera is going to mean that you get a blurry image. I took about 100 shots last night. Most of those were okay, but some were better than others, and some were better than others. And so even though I was using the same settings and I'm using a fairly stable tripod, you don't always get identical shots. I've also noticed that English photographer Gough has just done a video on shooting the moon too. If you want to check that one out, I'll put a link below, and I'll link it from my end screen as well. If you've liked this video and found it useful, please like, subscribe, tell your friends, click the little bell to get notified when I create new videos. But most importantly, remember, pixels are free, so get out there and shoot more. And hopefully, we'll be over this virus situation soon, so you can do that. Stay safe, stay well, and I'll see you again soon. Bye for now.